In our modern world, there have been many people who have proclaimed to be prophets. Some might say Jesus. Some might say Anakin Skywalker. Some might even say that homeless guy behind the Applebee's that I know for a fact is most definitely a prophet, but no one believes me. And then there's one more, Stephen, but no one talks about him because he is yet to be born. Today, we're going to be summoning Stephen and following his life throughout Worldbox until his ultimate demise. As you can see here, we have four kingdoms: the Southeastern Hegemony, the Western Federation, the Northeastern Empire, and Stevetopia. All of these kingdoms and empires are very young, as the world has just been created, but someone is about to arise from the ashes. And then on the faithful day, in Citrus of year 7, Stephen was born. He became a favorite quickly, and not only was he born attractive, but he was given the gift of immortality. Beyond that, he was lucky, he was genius, he was ambitious, he was strong-minded, honest, fast, and strong. Stephen was a force to be reckoned, and today we're going to be covering his entire life. So, starting out early, good old Stephen's not really doing that much. No one in this village actually know where he came from, because obviously he was spawned into the world. But as it is early, he's working on houses, and he's trying to make the village bigger. Stevetopia is about the same size as all the other villages, except for the Southeastern Hegemony, which has grown bigger over time, but it is the furthest away. Stephen works tirelessly cutting down trees. Stevetopia, however, is lagging behind in population, so the Western Federation and the Southeastern Hegemony have both expanded greatly, and have even formed new villages. Stevetopia founded a new village up north named Gafoon, but Stephen opted to stay in his home village of Fuoa. In the year 21, an alliance was formed between Stevetopia and the Western Federation, called the Pact of Eternal. Stevetopia began forming an army, but Stephen had not quite yet joined. Steve helped finish construction of the city's first farm. Despite having a fair amount of good traits, Stephen was still a fairly normal citizen, doing normal work, and in terms of health, damage, and things like that, he was a fairly average person. In terms of population, Stevetopia was still lagging behind its competitors, but the Northeastern Empire had joined the Pact of Eternal, strengthening their military and political alliance even further. With not much of a surprise to anyone, the Northeastern Empire declared war on the Southeastern Hegemony, bringing the entire Pact of Eternal into the war, including Stevetopia. However, at this point, Stephen had not yet joined the military. While Steve was at home farming, his army and the entire Pact of Eternal began ruthlessly fighting and destroying the Southeastern Hegemony, in brutal battle after brutal battle. However, despite the great impact and loss of Stevetopian troops during the war, there was almost nothing to show for it, as Stevetopia got no land or any benefits from the end of the war. And shortly following the war, the Pact of Eternal was formally dissolved. But one day, on a normal expedition outside of Stevetopia, Stephen ran into a devil, which he promptly took care of, using his insane power. But once the beast had been slain, Stephen wielded the screaming words, legendary sword, from the demon he conquered, giving him immense power and his first kill. The Western Federation eventually declared war on the Northeastern Empire, while Stevetopia just sat back and watched. And at this point, fearing the safety of his own country, Stephen joined the army. He was not the leader of his battalion, but he knew what he must do come the time for war, and without hesitation, Stevetopia declared war on the Northeastern Empire, and Stephen charged in the battle. Stephen helped his country take their first village, as they pushed even further south. Stephen got 2 kills in the battle, as they took another village. Stephen assisted with his army pushing in to the last village, and the war was finally over. The war was over, but only 2 kingdoms remained. The 2 sides of the Western Federation, now renamed the United South Empire, and Stevetopia, quickly grew a distrust for one another. Meanwhile, Stephen returned a war hero, as his king awarded him a medal for his brave sacrifice. However, in some of the northern cities of Stevetopia, evil pumpkins had taken over one of the farms, upset about how the farmers abused the land. Stephen and the army would have to move in to deal with the issue. They hastily moved in from the east, Stephen charging in and swiftly dealing with the pumpkin war. After the battle had concluded, Stephen himself had slain another 11 or so pumpkins. As time took its toll on the United Southern Federation, as we can see here, the New East Hegemony sparked a huge rebellion and revolution. Now, during this time, Stevetopia wanted to take advantage of the weakened situation. This village here of Isis was in a very vulnerable spot, and many Stevetopians were upset how this belonged to the United South Empire, despite clearly being encircled by Stevetopian villages. In an effort to reclaim that village, Stevetopia also declared war on the United South Empire and supported the new East hegemony. While Stephen knew what this meant, as we can see by his icon here, he had retired from the army. At his ripe old age of 84 and over almost 30 kills, he had served his time, and he was no longer involved in the army. After seeing many of his brothers perish in the Great Pumpkin Rebellion, he no longer had any interest in serving his country. But nonetheless, the Stevetopian army, with the help of the new East hegemony, began pushing further and further into the United South Empire. And just as it looked like the United South Empire had a great chance of winning this war, a new rebellion sparked up. The king of Stevetopia began to run a little mad with power at the opportunity that he had seized. He has now crossed 100 years old, and people were beginning to question if he was really fit to lead anymore. During this time, the leader had unfortunately imposed a strict draft upon its citizens, forcing Stephen to rejoin the army. Stephen went south as fast as he could to go and fight. However, in the midst of battle, a rebellion began in Stevetopia by a new empire known as Holy Greg. Stephen couldn't take this. Stephen, despite what he was told, he abandoned his home, and he made his own village and his own government in a kingdom that he called Steveland. Steve was very old and had many children, but at this point, it was going to be hard for anyone to actually populate Steveland. Luckily, many refugees seeking freedom from the Greg Stevetopian War came over seeking refuge, and suddenly Steveland had some merit to its name. In other news, the United South Empire finally struck a peace deal with the new East hegemony, keeping them independent, but only with the small village of Otto. On the other hand, the new East hegemony became very powerful. However, under a peace agreement, they did have to give up the entire west half of the land. All of the countries opted to just become independent. At the ripe old age at 102, Stephen became a king. He was happy. He made a little village for himself. He had his own house, and he even had a vacation retreat home. But knowing the storm that was coming, specifically with Stevetopia not being very happy with one of their own being a traitor, Steve quickly made the decision to try and join an alliance. Stephen decided it would be best for his country to join Our Axe, a large alliance that had grown up prominently featuring the southern United States and many of these independent countries over here. But just as Steve began getting comfortable with this life and having his own alliance and kingdom, Stevetopia and the new East hegemony, with their own very large alliance between them, quickly wanted to seize much of the land that had opened up once the war between Holy Greg had closed. Stevetopia declared war on Steveland. New East hegemony declared war on the southern United States. The United South Empire joined the war against the southern United States, and Holy Greg ignited another war against Stevetopia. Despite their alliance of Our Axe, Stevetopia and the New East hegemony were extremely powerful. Stephen would do all that he could to protect his new country. In the north, the Stevetopian army would charge in, and in the south, another army would begin pressuring it too. Stephen was unsure of what he could do in this situation. Stephen ultimately decided to try and fight, but ultimately, it was for nothing. In the grand year of 109, Stephen was slain by Attila. He took possession of Stephen's sword and craved it, thinking it was the best thing that he had ever won. Steve's home quickly fell. But little did he know, this would be the worst mistake that he ever made. As shortly after the passing of Stephen, the skies began rumbling, bombs falling. First on the new East hegemony, next on the original capital city, third right on top of the army that had killed Stephen, destroying his home in the process. Next on the north, then on the pumpkin patch, where Stephen had left the army for the first time. Many people thought the worst had passed after these nukes, but the wrath of Stephen was unmatched by anyone ever before seen. And while everyone continued their fighting in the war, several nukes were set off in the middle as a warning. Most people ignored them, until by the end of it, there were no survivors at all. Except, if you look around, you would still see a few kids running amok, mainly in the middle right here. And maybe you realize that all hope had not yet been lost. These kids clumped together and worked on their own, and suddenly one of them became an adult, and he began rebuilding. Despite the nukes, society had continued on. Another village. Many of the kids began populating. Any survivors began rushing to these new villages, and a little bit of green land that still existed. Suddenly, all over the place, survivors, and the new day had dawned, and they began doing their best to rebuild. But in one of these villages, named Dion, something weird happened. Out of nowhere, a new person just appeared. They were already a full-grown adult, and when a young child went up to him and asked him his name, he said his name was Steven Jr.